Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of MEMO's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Nasim. Thank you for having me, and it's always a pleasure.
So this week we'll be discussing the latest on Israel's failed military offensive in Gaza, confusion around the latest ceasefire proposal by President Joe Biden, or was it Benjamin Netanyahu? There's a lot of confusion around that. Allegations of the US State Department falsifying reports to absolve Israel of lopping aid to Gaza, the rise of extremist settlers, and Israel's High Court ruling in favor of Jewish settlers. And then we'll move to the shocking breaking news from last week by The Guardian exposing the decades-long war against the ICC and the intimidation campaign by Israel's spy chief. And then we'll end with the latest effort in Israel to designate UNRWA a terrorist organization and its potential implications. But let's begin with the situation on the ground. Can I get your thoughts beginning with an issue we touched on last week, which is the killing of an Egyptian soldier by Israeli fire, and the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Jabalia? We've seen horrific images of residents retrieving bodies from the rubble and trying to identify loved ones from dental markers. So let's get a quick update on the ground, starting with the fallout from last week's killing of the Egyptian soldier by Israeli soldiers.
Well, we haven't received many additional details about what exactly did and didn't happen last week between the Israeli and Egyptian militaries, except that Egypt appears to be taking an increasingly tougher position towards Israel. Just today, the Egyptian government announced that it would, contrary to previous reports, not open the Rafah crossing unless and until that the Palestinian side of that crossing was back in Palestinian hands and Israeli forces would withdraw. Because what also happened during the past week is that the Israeli military now controls the entirety of the border zone, what the Israelis refer to as a Philadelphia corridor. And this is of great concern to Egypt for a number of reasons, not least that the current disposition of Israeli forces far exceeds what Israel is permitted to station on that side of the border by the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And furthermore, Israel did so without any attempt at coordinating its moves with Egypt or seeking Egypt's approval for this. So I suspect that this is a situation that's going to develop into somewhat of a crisis if it continues for much longer. And an added factor, of course, is when you have Egyptians being killed and Egyptian treaties being violated, that increases the pressure on the government from within the Egyptian security establishment and certainly from Egyptian public opinion upon the Egyptian leadership to take a tougher stance towards Israel.
And last week, we also got further confirmation of just how badly this genocidal campaign is going for Israel. As many have suspected, there are more Hamas fighters in northern Gaza, supposedly an area cleared by Israeli forces months ago, than in Rafah, the city or the town which Israel said is the last stronghold of Hamas. And that's what Eyal Hulata, the head of Israel's National Security Council from 2021 and 2023 said. So we seem to have moved way past the point where Israel could claim to have achieved a decisive victory and entered into a phase where Israel's just trying to save face now. There does not seem to be any way of trying to eradicate and destroy Hamas, because Hamas is propping up again in northern Gaza when Israel has been saying to us, to everyone, to the world, that Rafah is the last stronghold, when it's far from the case.
Yes, I mean, the Israelis would have us believe there are only 4 Hamas battalions left. They're in Rafah. They're Hamas's weakest battalions. And when Israel succeeds in dismantling those, as it has so successfully done in the northern Gaza Strip, in Gaza City, and in Khan Yunis, once it achieves that, it'll be game over. And as you know, what we are now learning is that Israeli officials are saying that, in fact, the recent battles in Jabalia and the Jabalia refugee camp just outside Gaza City are the fiercest fighting that Israel has been confronted with since October 7th. So I don't think it's so much a question of Hamas popping up again in these regions, but rather of having never been defeated in the first place. And I think we now need to ask ourselves why Israel withdrew from the northern Gaza Strip, from Gaza City, and later from Khan Yunis without achieving any military objectives. It appears to be the case that Israel, confronted with failure and increasing losses, decided not to continue with its offensive and to try its luck elsewhere. In this case, Rafah. And the other reports that are emerging now is that the Gaza government's civilian agencies, the police and so on, are also reemerging, preventing, for example, price gouging, coordinating the distribution of humanitarian aid, and carrying out basic police and civil functions. They're doing so on a very low scale because Israel, in its efforts to ensure that only chaos and anarchy reign in the Gaza Strip, has been directly targeting these civilian agency officials, police, and so on, to prevent them from seeking to establish any kind of civil order in areas of the Gaza Strip from which they've withdrawn.
So Israel, not only is it losing control of its military campaign operation in Gaza, but also losing control of the narrative, and more so on this latest issue regarding a ceasefire proposal. There seems to be a lot of confusion around this latest proposal, manufactured confusion, I would say. Is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejecting his own ceasefire proposal, which the US President Joe Biden announced over the weekend? And is this the same proposal which Hamas offered way back in February? I mean, what's the situation here?
It's too bizarre for words, really. What you had is the U.S. president publicly presenting what he stated was an Israeli proposal to end this war, and basically throwing the ball in Hamas's court to accept or reject what Biden presented as a last chance deal. It makes sense that it was an Israeli deal because Washington, of course, has a so-called no surprises agreement with Israel, meaning that Washington will not propose any diplomatic initiative unless it has been coordinated and cleared with the Israeli government. So you have the US president presenting what he states is an Israeli deal. Then you have the Israelis come out and say, actually, this is not the deal we formulated and that Biden has embellished it. Then you have senior US officials saying that, in fact, this is exactly the deal that we received from the Israelis. The only difference is the Israelis asked us to keep it confidential and we decided to make it public. And now you have the Israelis saying that actually what Biden presented was only elements of the deal we formulated and not the deal in its entirety. And for good measure, you now have several Israeli ministers, the lunatic fringe, Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist, and his fellow traveler, Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, claiming that this deal has never been presented to them, and that if it is presented to them and is consistent with what they've been hearing and reading in the press, then they are going to ensure that the Israeli governing coalition collapses. I think what's happening here is that Biden is seeking to go over the heads of the Israeli leadership and appeal directly to Israeli public opinion and the Israeli opposition and so on. But he has two problems. The first is that it's in fact Netanyahu with his invitation now to address a joint session of the US Congress. It is Netanyahu who is going over the heads of the White House and Biden and the US government and appealing directly to US political elites and US public opinion. And secondly, this will have exactly the same outcome as all previous attempts by the US to influence Israeli policy. Namely, the US stakes out a position, the US establishes red lines, pressure points, and so on, anticipating that the Israelis will basically change their behavior in accordance with US wishes because of this pressure. Israel doesn't respond, does as it sees fit. And what does the US do? It does not attach consequences to Israel's rejection of US preferences, but the US basically folds. It shifts the goalposts. It claims, well, this isn't really what we wanted, and blames the Palestinians.
So it's another example of where Biden is made to look weak, ineffective, especially, and this is devastating for him in an election year. So let's see where that takes us. You also mentioned red line. The US this week said that, or last week said that there is no, that Israel did not breach its red line. But that's not how the French view that. I mean, the French have come out and said that in light of Israel's operation in Rafah, Israeli companies will not be allowed to participate in an exhibition in France in the middle of June. So the French have a position which is completely opposite to the Americans. The Americans believe that Israel has not crossed the red line, which was set for Israel in the previous months. So, I mean, the talk of red line is just a ploy to buy time. Is that really not the case?
Yes, it's smoke and mirrors and a diversionary maneuver. I think 8 months into this, we have to accept that there is no red line in Washington for Israeli behavior. Israel is doing as it pleases, can do as it pleases, and will continue to do as it pleases. And the consistent line from the US is that Israel has violated neither any international laws regarding the laws of war or war crimes or crimes against humanity, nor has it even violated any domestic US legislation regarding export of weapons and so on. And we've seen this now with reports that the State Department under Antony Blinken is actually falsifying reports so that Washington can continue to support Israel with weapons and so on, which would otherwise be a violation of US domestic legislation, because under this legislation, military assistance cannot be given to a foreign government that is blocking the delivery of US humanitarian aid, which of course, as any 3-year-old knows, is exactly what Israel has been doing since October 7th, if not for many years before that. The US officials, specialists in the State Department and so on, have been producing reports that quite clearly state that this is exactly what Israel has been doing. But the State Department leadership has decided to rewrite those reports so that the unconditional assistance to Israel, unconditional US assistance to Israel can continue. We're seeing a somewhat different position in Europe. Most recently, the French decision to prohibit Israeli arms manufacturers from participating in this major defense armaments or this armaments fair. And those are the kinds of things which will have a cumulative effect on Israeli conduct. Of course, much more is needed at a much faster pace, but we're now also seeing, for example, the EU convening to discuss the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which has very clear human rights clauses and which makes Israel's privileges under that agreement dependent on its observance of fundamental human rights principles, which of course is something that Israel has never done. But several European governments are now beginning to take the key clauses of this agreement more seriously than they have in the past.
The falsification of reports you're referring to, that came out as after a whistleblower, a former senior US official who resigned last week, Stacey Gilbert. She spoke out exposing how the State Department has been falsifying reports to give Israel the green light. Again, shows how there seems to be nothing the US won't be willing to do in defending Israel's genocide. But Stacey Gilbert is one of many US officials who resigned because of the nefarious practices, let's just say, of the State Department. I think you can find that online, and it's quite. Sorry, you want to say something?
No, I suspect that immediately after doctoring these reports, Antony Blinken went out and gave a keynote speech on human rights and rule of law and how important it is for everyone else to observe them.
Well, let's turn our attention to the West Bank. We've not really spoken much about the West Bank in our weekly reviews. There's a lot happening there. There's every day you see horrific scenes of ethnic cleansing. Recently, the New York Times published an extensive, detailed report on extremist settlers who they say have taken over Israel. That's their word. I'm quoting directly. Extremist settlers have taken over Israel. So the report from the New York Times looked at the progress of radical extremist ideology, who at one time were in the fringes of Israeli society, are now in the center of power in Israel. And when you read the report, you realize how much of an influence and a sway they have within government. So I wonder, is it even possible to put the genie of Jewish supremacy and settler violence back in the bottle, especially as it's really well funded by movements, charities in the UK, in the US, and other parts of the world. So there's a global Israel project which includes the support of extremist settlers outside Israel. And I'm wondering, is it even possible to actually separate the settlements and the ethnic cleansing and genocidal campaigns that we're seeing in the West Bank from the state ideology itself?
No, and the prospect of that happening is as likely as going back to the 1960s or 70s and separating the ideology of white supremacy from South Africa's apartheid regime, for example. Yes, there has been a growing infiltration, if you will, of these extremist elements into Israeli state institutions, the military, the government, now 2 senior ministers, at least, for example, and other institutions. But the idea that these are separate entities that are kind of in conflict with each other, I think really misses the point. What has happened is that the Israeli state and Israeli society, particularly since 1973, has been shifting ever further rightwards. And an important explanation of that phenomenon is that with every shift further to the right, there have been absolutely no consequences for Israel doing so and the actions that are associated with that from the West, who are Israel's main backers. So it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Israel shifts to the right. Western support of Israel increases or is unchanged. Israel then shifts further to the right, such that, for example, as Norman Finkelstein has observed, today you don't really have a center and a right in Israel. You have the right wing and the extreme right and the fanatical right, and that is increasingly kind of the limits of the Israeli political spectrum. And as far as these settler movements are concerned, I think it's much more useful to think of them as the vanguard of Israeli state policy in the occupied territories. They're more of an auxiliary militia, which is increasingly carrying out the functions of the regular Israeli military and is, of course, at all times enabled, armed, and protected by the Israeli military. We need to look at them as an auxiliary militia that is increasingly carrying out the functions of the regular military rather than some kind of autonomous or vigilante force that is acting in violation of state policy.
And settler violence isn't the only way Palestinians in the West Bank are being expelled and dispossessed of their property. Last week, Israeli court last week, the High Court of Justice on yesterday, rejected a petition by the Shahada family from Silwan. The court ruled that the family must vacate their property in Silwan in favor of Jewish residents. Peace Now, which is American activist group, an NGO, made a statement saying that this is a political move under the guise of legal proceedings for the forcible displacement of a Palestinian community and its replacement by settlers in the heart of a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem. So when you look at a decision like this by the Israeli High Court, and there are many we can cite, it's hard to see how anyone can reasonably make a distinction between the violent extremist Jewish settlers and the Israeli court. Strategically, both want the same thing, which is ethnic cleansing, though tactically we can say they have a different approach.
Yes, and the Israeli judiciary is in fact very deeply implicated in Israeli state policy towards the Palestinians. It is the institution that has done more than any other to legitimize Israeli policy domestically and internationally. And I think it's an important point because as we're now talking, for example, about arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court, the ICC operates on the basis of complementarity, which means that where national courts and the national judiciary adequately or competently deals with particular crimes, then the ICC no longer has jurisdiction over them. And Israel, in contrast to similar states in the past, has really been a stickler for legal detail. In other words, it doesn't just evict people from their homes. It has an entire judicial and administrative process it follows before doing so. And this involves, as in this case, appeals to the Israeli High Court of Justice and so on. But in the end, the outcome is extremely predictable because particularly where the state claims that there is an issue of national security at stake, the Israeli judiciary, and particularly the High Court of Justice, almost instinctively sides with the government. And it's all, speaking of international courts, it's also, I think, quite interesting that Judge Aharon Barak, the former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, who was celebrated internationally by fraudsters like Alan Dershowitz for jealously guarding the independence of the Israeli judiciary and so on, is among the individuals most deeply implicated in whitewashing Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as apartheid and deportations and house demolitions and all the rest of it, under the guise of following legal principles.
Let's turn our attention to the big revelation from last week. Two-part article by The Guardian exposing Israel's nearly decade-long war against the International Criminal Court. So Israel deployed many of its assets, including its chief spy officer, to intimidate and threaten the former ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. The story many would have found sensational, but for those who follow this issue closely, to me, it seemed like the intimidation of judges, intimidation of politicians by Israel is the worst kept secret in the world. Most people know this is going on, don't they?
I suspect many people had a hunch because, as you recall, in the weeks prior to the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan issuing applications for arrest warrants for Israel's prime minister and defense minister, the press was full of reports that this was about to happen, that Israel was mobilizing its Western allies, the United States, the UK, and others to exercise pressure on the court not to do so. And one only has to ask, well, if this is supposedly a highly confidential, secretive process, how did Israel find out about it? Why was Israel mobilizing pressure? And then you had the further statement by Khan warning people that efforts to exercise pressure on the court and to interfere with its operations is a violation of the Rome Statute of itself and could lead to further arrest warrants. There's an interesting antecedent here, which is that several years ago, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz was in possession of much of this information, had conducted a major investigation, and was about to publish the story itself. Israel operates under very strict military censorship, particularly of all matters related to what is considered security and defense and national security and so on. The reporter in question was called in by the Mossad, Israel's external foreign intelligence agency, and was told in no uncertain terms, very mafia style, that if he went ahead and published the story, he and his family would suffer real consequences. You know, the kinds of things you see in movies. What is now emerged again, you know, helps explain why people are prone to refer to Israel as a mafia state. I mean, the head of Israel's foreign intelligence agency basically shows up unannounced into a meeting that the ICC, former ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda was holding with the leader of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Joseph Kabila, and you know, starts offering blandishments, making threats, calling her at home. An anonymous person shows up on her doorstep and gives her an envelope full of cash, you know, and all kinds of things, including trying to find out who the Palestinians are who have been providing affidavits to Palestinian human rights organizations that these organizations are subsequently transferring to the office of the ICC prosecutor. And in addition to that, then retroactively opening sham investigations into such incidents so that the ICC would not, so that the ICC would invoke the principle of complementarity and therefore not proceed with arrest warrants on these cases. It's really too much for words. It's a very easily available investigation on the Guardian's website, and I would encourage everyone to read it. I mean, the extremes to which the Mossad went and the extremes to which many other Israeli government agencies went, the Prime Minister's office, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Office of the Judge Advocate General, and so on, to collect all this information and try to use it to delay and ultimately prevent these indictments. It's really breathtaking. But I think it also needs to be pointed out that in the end, Israel failed. And the reason Israel failed is only in part because of the brazen and systematic nature of their crimes. I think it's also the growing public outrage, the growing public and political and legal pressure on the ICC prosecutor to take his job seriously when it comes to Palestine, meant that that pressure outweighed the efforts at blackmail and bribery and all the rest of it that were coming from Israel's intelligence agencies.
It is worth repeating that this was a 10-year-long campaign against the ICC.
Yes.
And Karim Khan, of course, is seeking arrest warrants. Do you think, though, he would have continued the work of his predecessor if 7 October did not happen, if Israel was not engaged in a genocide? And would the decade-long campaign against the ICC have come out the way it did in the two-part Guardian piece? I suspect not, but what do you think?
You may well be right. I mean, if you go back and look at Fatou Bensouda, I think if we look at it with hindsight, many of the things that she did now begin to make sense. She took numerous additional steps before launching an investigation that one would not necessarily have expected her to take. And the charitable explanation is that faced with all this pressure from the Israelis, and not only from the Israelis, I should add, the Israelis also mobilized the Americans to make all kinds of threats against her. And at one point, she was put on a list by the U.S. State Department that is normally reserved for terrorists and organized criminals. But I think the charitable explanation was that she sought to ensure that every T was crossed multiple times and every I was properly dotted multiple times before advancing to the next stage, precisely because of this kind of pressure and spying that was going on. And this continued, of course, under Karim Khan. And one has to presume that similar campaigns are now being conducted against the judges who constitute the pretrial chamber, which has to assess Khan's applications for arrest warrants and either confirm or deny them. So this is an ongoing story. We know it's been going on for 10 years, maybe longer, but we can certainly conclude it continues.
And related to the nearly decade-long campaign against the ICC is the more than 70-year-long war against UNRWA. Last week, the Israeli parliament passed a motion to approve a bill designating UNRWA a terrorist organization. Presumably, if UNRWA is proscribed, it would not be permitted to operate in the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip, where some 3 million refugees rely on UNRWA. What would be the implications of such a draconian measure?
Well, just a small correction. Israel has not been waging a 75-year campaign against UNRWA. That campaign is of somewhat more recent provenance. And the issue is really not UNRWA itself, but the refugees. And Israel relates to UNRWA as the most visible surrogate for the refugees, for their status as refugees, and for their rights as refugees under relevant UN resolutions. Of course, UNRWA is not a political agency. It has no responsibilities with respect to the rights of the refugees, which exist independently of UNRWA. But Israel and its US backers seem to think that if you get rid of UNRWA, the whole refugee question will evaporate into thin air, which of course is not going to happen. But this is really a key issue where you have a UN member state declaring a UN agency to be a terrorist organization. And in addition, doing so not only without any evidence or proof, but in this case, presenting all kinds of widely discredited fraudulent proof. And I don't think we should look at this as an issue between Israel and UNRWA. I really think we need to look at this as an issue between Israel and the international community, between Israel and the United Nations General Assembly, which created UNRWA, which has repeatedly reauthorized UNRWA, and which is ultimately responsible for the continued existence of UNRWA. Will Israel be allowed to declare UNRWA a terrorist organization and treat it as it does other terrorist organizations that it has designated without any consequences? Or if it insists on proceeding this, will the UN General Assembly finally recognize that the real problem is that Israel is a lawless state and that Israel is the one that needs to suffer consequences for its lawless behavior? Israel has already informed UNRWA that it needs to vacate its headquarters in Jerusalem, I believe, by the end of this month, and has taken all kinds of other measures. And really, this is the time. This is a moment of truth for the international community. This is a moment of truth for the United Nations General Assembly, because if it does not respond to this kind of brazenly, outrageously lawless behavior, as it did to South Africa, the white minority regime of South Africa in the 1970s, and suspend its membership of the UN General Assembly, then the signal it's sending to Israel is anything goes, even against the organization that we represent.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in. See you next week for another episode of MEMO's Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, as usual, Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Nasim.